Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about our work and to hear feedback as much as possible. This is, as probably most of the work that's being done on consciousness is just in its beginnings. So I want to acknowledge an intellectual debt to Roger Sperry from the bottom up on this slide, who wrote in 1969, first conscious awareness in the present view is interpreted to be a dynamic emergent property of cerebral excitation. So although we think now that you don't have to have a brain or even to be alive in the biological sense to be conscious, I think that the keywords of dynamics and emergence are just spot on here. The middle snapshot is the title of a paper that I was fortunate to join forces on with Tomer Fekete. Came out about 10 years ago, a computational theory of experience. And the latest one, co-authored, led by Roy Moyal, Tomer Fekete, and myself, Dynamic Emergence Theory. So here's what I plan to talk about. First, what is basic consciousness? That's my focus. And then what basic consciousness is. Actually, that point I already have. It's in the title of the slide. Basic consciousness is dynamic autodiagnosis. And I have to explain why. That'll be the next order of business. I will offer an example from insect olfaction. Then a computational account built around the notions of coarse-graining and macrostates and metastability. I have a brief example from our own data, EEG data on human vision, and then I'll entertain some objections, and I will conclude, as you'll see, with a happy ending. So probably what is the most important slide in my presentation is this one, the Tower of Consciousness. I think it's important to avoid the futile debates. Is this consciousness? Is that consciousness? We have to acknowledge that consciousness has many levels, many layers. Starting with the bottom, what I call the basic phenomenal awareness includes discernibles, telling things apart, this as opposed to that, and also feelings which go together. So in evolved consciousness, feelings always accompany discernibles, so things can be scary or tasty. And it's important to realize, I think, that things can be scary or tasty or otherwise felt without there being any self. So there can be, in our opinions, something that's called non-egoic. I think that's Thomas Metzinger's expression, non-egoic consciousness. And on top of that, one can build, some creatures do have a self, at least at times operating above this basic level. And that's where you find feelings such as the feeling of existence, I am, body ownership, this is me, perspective, I'm here, agency, as in I want this to happen. Above that, more self, that's where things happen when you get language, in particular stories we tell about ourselves, meta-awareness, higher order consciousness, reflection, the capacity for reflection. And on top of that, things like intersectional identity, social personas, class consciousness. If you're not sure what that is about, talk to me later and I'll try to explain to you the value in joining a union. So that's the entire tower. It doesn't have to be this way in creatures like us. The entire tower is not at all times present, but the foundation is present. And that's what I want to focus on today, the basic, what I call the basic phenomenal awareness. So the gist of our theory, the dynamical emergence theory, is that a system whose dynamics, I'm just reading this capsule review, a system whose dynamics results in a qualitatively distinct to itself, that's important, qualitatively distinct state-space trajectory, is thereby phenomenally aware of the distinction. Again, distinction, by that I mean this, not that, or that. diagnosis. That's the origin of our picking the word diagnosis for this. There are two concepts involved here. One is that of discernibles, which necessarily arise out of diagnosis. The ones that are interesting to us in the context of consciousness are the outcome of intrinsic autodiagnosis. So if some other system diagnoses this one that is under consideration, it's beside the point for the consciousness, such as it may be, of the system under consideration. So the diagnosis has to be intrinsic. And feelings always, again, in evolved systems, because of evolutionary pressure, feelings such as valence, positive or negative affect, pain, and so on, are outcome predictive aspects of discernibles, which are put in place by evolution. And a key component or a key aspect of feelings is that they are obligatory. They're also intrinsically action-oriented, but the obligatory nature of feelings is extremely important. We can't just decide not to feel pain or not to feel good or bad about something. This is related to many central ideas in consciousness theory, the notion of transparency, in part that is discussed by Metzinger. Also the possibility of suffering, which Metzinger also is among the key figures who discuss that. The possibility of suffering is in place because feelings are obligatory. You can just decide that or at least not very easily, that would be circumventing the evolutionary constraints. You can't decide just not to feel something. So with that couple of key concepts in mind, let's look at some constraints that stem from them. The first one is basic consciousness requires non-trivial dynamics. A system with boring dynamics, which means state space that is devoid of intrinsic structure, does not afford intrinsic diagnosis. So a rock can change state. It can, for one thing, get warmer or colder, which would be kind of non-interesting because even if you draw a line, if you put a threshold, decide what's above that threshold is really warm and what's below is really cold, the threshold would be arbitrary because otherwise intrinsically that kind of one-dimensional state space is not differentiated by the rock itself. So that's boring, no consciousness, not even basic consciousness. If you take a rock and suspend it from a chain or a piece of rope, you get one of those gadgets that are very popular, especially outside pubs in the UK. This is an example from one such suspended rock, which is called the weather stone. It says here, for instance, stone underwater, it's flood, shadow on the wall, it's sunny, stone gone, tornado, and so on. It's kind of funny, you know. Every time I hear this joke, I find it a bit funny. It's particularly funny in the context of consciousness because, you know, the rock does not do this one, like the one on the previous slide, does not do its own diagnosis. So no consciousness here. What about this so-called useless box contraption? So it has two intrinsically distinct metastable states. Let me play the clip. And it tells those states apart from one another on its own. It actually also then acts on the outcome of the diagnosis. You mess with it, it tries to get back to its preferred state. Definitely there is an intrinsic discernible here. It's kind of one bit of discernment. And I venture to say, I know I'm sticking my neck out, I venture to say there's also kind of one bit of feeling here because the discernment includes a motive which actually the box cannot resist, not that it tries to resist, to do something about a state that is dispreferred by it. So basic consciousness, just reverting again to the title of the slide, basic consciousness is dynamic autodiagnosis. Now, phenomenal experience, including feelings, of course, discernment does not require a brain. So in this clip, we see some single cell animals. The one in the middle kind of clearly wants to be elsewhere, but it's caught by its flagellum. It cannot actually move. It's clearly motivated, it's trying to move, but it cannot. And you know, one can talk for a long time describing recent results on the kind of cognition you find in, say, E. coli bacteria or in amoebas. And on our account, that means they have basic phenomenal experience. Not a lot of it, but some discernibles and some feelings. Here's an example from olfaction coming up. It'll kind of build up over the next few slides. And on this one, what we see is less than one discernible. So a system that can sense the presence of a chemical. This is one that's often used in the study of olfaction, citral, kind of citrusy smell to creatures like us. If you can just sense this, you don't have one discernible. Obviously, for there to be a discernible, you have to have at least one other thing which you can discern from this one. So here's another compound very closely related to citral. This is geraniol, just a hydroxyl here instead of the oxygen. And if you can tell this apart from that, then you have diagnosis, you have telling apart, and you have potentially a basis for experience. So how do you tell citral apart from geraniol? You can do it with a machine. Of course, a living creature would have a different kind of machine, but here, the one you see here is one of the first mass spectrometers, and it can produce for each of those two compounds. You can see at the bottom, the mass spectrum for citral, and on the right, the mass spectrum for geraniol, and they are different. They are not identical, and so thereby you have a difference. And this is a basis for diagnosis, but of course, the mass spectrometer just offers the spectra for the consumption of whom? Of someone else. Okay, let's see who can use it. Francis Aston, the guy who perfected this machine. I think he may have gotten a Nobel Prize for this. Here, if he's on the scene, he would be doing the telling apart. So the mass spectrometer on itself, on its own, cannot do that. But here is another machine, a locust, studied very often by people who are interested in animal olfaction. The illustration here, the one you see right now, there will be two more popping up in a second, is from Georgi Bouzaki's paper on cell assemblies and readout. Very important, the concept of readout. Let me very briefly describe the whole setup comes from the work from the lab of Gilles Laurent. This is a schematic diagram of a circuit that you find in the antenna lobe in insects like locusts. So the antenna in a locust is a sense of olfaction. It's not, you know, a Wi-Fi antenna. Here you see the two of them. And in the antenna lobe, there are so-called projection neurons, which are connected to the actual sensory neurons that bind to odorants. And then the projection neurons project to the mushroom body, where you have kinyon cells which do the readout from the outputs of those projection neurons. So one important thing to note here is, as this diagram actually shows, there is inhibition and excitation and feedback from the projection neurons to themselves. So non-trivial dynamics ensues. In fact, there are interesting results in computability. A circuit like that has very, very powerful properties insofar as computational capacity goes. There's also the gamma rhythm. So the kind of dynamics you find in such circuits is periodic, and the phase and the relative phase of those oscillations in different parts of the circuit carries a lot of information. So that information is read out by the kinyon cells, and then what you can do with the data that you record from an animal like this is plot in a reduced dimensionality space the trajectory that ensues when the animal is presented with an odorant. So here's a plot from the actual paper by Laurent and others from 2006, again in reduced dimensionality space. This point is the beginning, the steady state before an odorant is presented. This is the activity, the joint activity of the projection neurons. And then when citral is offered to the animal, the green trajectory happens, it returns to the steady state after a while. When in contrast, geranule is presented, the blue trajectory ensues. And this would be like entirely beside the point for the animal behavior if it were not for the readout from the projection neurons by the kinyon cell. And what you can see here is actually at the time when you have the maximum separation between the two trajectories, each corresponding to a different odorant, this is where the kinyon cell that was actually recorded from kicks into action. You see the spikes here, and readout happens, and this information about the diagnosis is passed on to the rest of the locust's brain. Now, this kind of dynamic that causes the divergence of trajectories, it leads to, in some cases, to qualitative distinctions, and that's important for them to be robust and qualitative, and they must arise intrinsically from the system's dynamics. A good conceptual handle onto this idea is the conceptual tool of energy landscape. Some of you may know my favorite illustration for this kind of qualitatively different trajectories in a system state space is this topographic map from a corner of California, actually, that is very close to my heart, because that's actually where my heart is. This is in Death Valley in California. And what you see here is on the topo map, a saddle point here shown in red. And then you can go from the saddle either up through the marble, so-called Marble Canyon, or down through the Cottonwood Canyon, and eventually you get to the confluence of the two. And those two trajectories are qualitatively different. Being inside a canyon, either this one or that one, is what we can call a macrostate. It's coarse-grained. It's not as fine resolution, a pinpointing of one's location in the state space as the actual precise location. Macrostates are, by a well-known definition, a partition of the system state space, which is self-predictive, so they are stable over time, and they are qualitatively different. Again, to use the example from topography, if you're a bird, you can cross from one canyon to another. If you're a rock climber, you might be able to do that. Otherwise, you are confined. Once you chose to go left at the saddle, you're confined to the Marble Canyon. If you chose to go to go right, you're confined to the other canyon. You can think of the development of such discernment ability, maybe over evolutionary time, maybe over the development of the organism. Initially, the situation starts with the two routes being not discernible, and they become discernible eventually. A good picture to keep in mind to illustrate this may be the emergence of the Himalayas. On the left is the Indian plate slamming into the Eurasian plate, and this gives rise to a huge barrier. The rise of the Himalayas, of course, played at quite a speed up. And the Himalayas are a barrier. You can go on the north, to the north of them, or to the south of them. It's kind of hard to cross them. And again, that's the point of there being a qualitative difference, a qualitative discernible, which is intrinsic to the system because it arises from the dynamics of the system. It's not dictated from the outside. Now, returning to this notion of macrostates, a great starting point to learn about macrostates is this classic paper by James Crutchfield from '94, the Calculi of Emergence, Computation, Dynamics, and Induction. Crutchfield writes about emergence, the appearance on the scene of interesting structure as, first of all, being observer dependent, which might be a bit worrisome, but immediately he adds emergence is intrinsic when the system self-observes. So we saw an example, of course, in this locust olfactory system of self-observation and the emergent telling apart of the state space trajectories corresponding to the two odorants. The third point from that part of Crutchfield's paper notes that causal states, of course, causality is crucially important here. Causal states are those that make the future conditionally independent of the past. I will return to the question of causality a bit later because it's a perennial question. Every time you claim emergence, some novelty, some level on which interesting things happen, people start asking, what about the levels below it? Are things there made thereby non-interesting, or what, what's going on with the lower levels, and what's the proper level on which to discuss the possible existence of phenomenality or consciousness. So what then we can do with those concepts that I've highlighted so far is describe or conceptualize experience, conceive of experience as one metastable macrostate after another. You may have heard about some theories of consciousness that equate phenomenality, like the perception of redness, a particular discernible, equate that with the falling into an attractor. But of course, that cannot be the case, because in a system like that, you can only have like one percept in your lifetime if you take the concept of the attractor seriously. Of course, what it has to be is a destabilized attractor, which becomes maybe a saddle, and then you roll one way or another, and then essentially the state follows what's called a heteroclinic channel, which itself could be stable, but the state of the system falls off one saddle into the next one without getting stuck in any of them. That's metastability. The regions around the saddles are macrostates, each of which includes many, possibly a large number of points at the more basic level. And that's what experience is on this kind of dynamic account. It's one metastable macrostate after another. This kind of rolling down a heteroclinic channel has been described by the initiators of this idea as chaotic itinerancy. One of the first discussions of that concept is in the work of Ichiro Tsuda, in particular in the 2001 Behavioral and Brain Sciences paper. But of course, metastability has been also discussed by many others, by Scott Kelso, by Carl Friston, by Walter Freeman, by many others. A quote from Tsuda's 2001 paper is kind of illuminating here. He wrote, "Dynamical orbits are attracted to a certain attractor ruin, but they leave via an unstable manifold after a short or long stay around it and move toward another attractor ruin." So on some level, on this level of description, this is what we hold experience to be, rolling down a heteroclinic channel. So switching gears a bit, let me tell you what, according to our take, is the structure of experience like. There are two complementary aspects to measuring the structure of experience. The first one is, think of it as kind of synchronic. The second one is diachronic. So the first one is the similarity structure of a set of experiences is a forest of trees, just like the structure of perceptual and conceptual spaces. And of course, this is a prime desideratum for a theory of consciousness. You have a formal theory. It has to reproduce the phenomenology of experience of, for one thing, animals like ourselves, in particular, the structure of our perceptual and conceptual spaces. So that's the first order of business. The second one is the temporal structure of experience, which, as we already saw, is a directed graph in which each node is a macrostate. Now we can approach armed with these ideas, we can approach the challenge of quantifying experience, the amount of experience, according to our view, is a measure that it's an empirical measure that should reflect the topological complexity of the system's state space trajectories, so that a topologically complex trajectory would correspond to a class of rich experiences and the precise shape of a trajectory, because this is about topology, not the precise geometry. The topology constrains the precise shape, but that does not uniquely determine it. So you may have categorical differences, for one thing, between percepts, each of which could incorporate finer distinctions which do not become or do not grow to be categorical. There is a mathematical framework for that, and that's the framework of the persistent topology of data. Persistence, the concept of persistence, comes from the need for a measure like this. I mean, they've invented the whole framework in computational topology, and we basically borrow it from them. The need for persistence comes from the need from our need for the measure of the amount of experience, the nature of experience, to be robust. You don't want it to change with every little change in the smallest component of the system. So think of a bunch of points that come from your measurement of some system in question, and you can have a topology induced over that set of points by varying the radius within which the points, so 2 points have to fall to be considered as one or as connected. Depending on the size of this epsilon, this region, you will get different numbers of connected components and different numbers of holes, which is what you need to give assign a topological structure to an otherwise unstructured point set or set of points in a metric space. So you can see here, varying the radius, this epsilon, you get different connectivities. And when you plot the persistence of each of those components, like the hole that comes into being, persists for a while and then disappears, you plot that against the epsilon, against the size of the window, you get something that's called the barcode. I will not go into detail here, but basically for the different types of connected components or different holes of different order, first order holes, second order holes, and so on, you get for each of them a bar. And the bars that persist the longest are the most robust description of the topology of the system. So what you can do is apply this machinery to some recording of the state space trajectory, say of a human brain or the brain of a different animal. And that would give you a handle onto the amount of experience that the system is undergoing. So you from the outside measuring the topology of the trajectory. And by the way, if the trajectory is like a straight line, it would be very, very boring in terms of topology. But once it becomes curving, once it starts to curve, think of varying this radius. You can get entirely non-trivial descriptions in terms of those barcodes of trajectories, which do not actually need to be like, you know, including rings and hole, something that we would categorize as holes in one of those classical examples used to introduce the idea of topology, like, you know, like a mug. People say, like, topologists think that a mug and a donut are of the same order, right? So that you don't have to have that kind of actually closed holes, because the closure is always up to this parameter, which you can change and see what happens. So the need to play with the parameter, of course, comes from our being outside the system. The system on the inside knows what it experiences, but from the outside, we can use this kind of measurement. This actually works, at least on toy examples. Here's on the left, a Lorentz attractor. In the middle, a recording, a time line of one of the dimensions, one of the 3 dimensions. On the right, a reconstruction. You may have heard about theorems that prove that this kind of reconstruction is possible. Now, what you can also do is ignore the time order of the points, just look at their relative spacing, produce a barcode and see which are the longest bars. And in fact, if you scrutinize this diagram, this is from a paper by Garland from 2016, you can see the two major holes in this attractor recovered by this means. So this actually works again for toy examples. Let me quickly tell you about an experiment and the analysis of the data from that experiment that we are in the middle now. This is work with Roy Moyal. The conceptual underpinnings are summarized in this paper, which came out a few years ago, Dynamic Computation and Visual Thalamocortical Networks. The central premise, and we did not invent it, but it's an insight which we adopt, that the brain approximates symbolic computation by transitioning between metastable attractive states. So, you know, there doesn't have to be a disconnect between people who think in terms of Turing machines and people who think in terms of state space trajectories of continuous dynamical systems. There is a beautiful bridge between those formalisms, and one can walk the bridge in either direction. Another key concept here is the importance of the gamma rhythm. So the cortex in humans, many other neural structures in other species, produces oscillations, and that's where the signal that we are after lives, and we need to process those data to try to find the metastable states and then characterize the topological complexity and all of that. So the data for this experiment come from an EEG system that has 128 electrodes, standard map of where the electrodes are placed over the scalp. This is myself with one of those caps. I actually produced data that could not be used because I don't have any hair, which means the skin on my head, my scalp, is just impervious to anything, and it's useless to try to use me as an EEG subject. But you know, a good selfie ensued. What I will show is data from one subject. This is very much work in progress. The analysis is in progress. What one of the stages in one of the experiments in the study involved was passive observation. The relevant factors here were the stimulus type. This is visual stimulus, a bar like here or a grating like here, which could be of one of two orientations. So you have two stimuli types and two orientations. And then we also manipulated expectation on part of the subject, because one of the points in the study was to examine the interaction of expectation and attention. I will not be reporting that. I'll just talk about what happens in the passive observation phase of one of the experiments. So expectation was manipulated as follows. In some blocks, the stimulus that comes next was unpredictable, 50-50, could be, for instance, if it's about orientation, 50-50 this way or that way, or it could be predictable, not completely predictable, but 80% to 20% predictability. So that induced expectations. The timeline, passive observation, 1 second without stimulus, and then for 4 seconds, linear increase of contrast. At some point, the subject becomes aware here of the presence of a grating, and then full visibility for, again, 1000 milliseconds. We processed the gamma band, the gamma oscillations, which I mentioned earlier, for the entire set of 128 by 128 matrix of similarities between the different electrode activities. So each electrode has gamma oscillation, it has voltage changing over time. In the gamma band, which is between 30 and 40 hertz, those oscillations are what they are. What you can do is compare the phase, relative phase for each pair of electrodes. So that goes into a big 128 by 128 matrix. And you can see those dimensions along the abscissa and ordinate here. And phase locking, as you can see on the scale on the right, can be larger or smaller, and thereby you can individuate each state, and you can look for regions in this very large state space that are self-predictive and kind of stable. So there are different algorithms for that. The one that we used yielded 4 macrostates, which you can see here. I mean, I can say, I'll give you a few seconds to assimilate this information. Of course, it's meaningless to us, except there's some block structure to think what it implies, but we don't need to go into those details. This is just one of 8 plots like that, each having 4 macrostates. 8 because there are 2 expectation conditions, 2 stimulus types, and 2 orientations. So this one is for E plus, so expectation in place, bar, and 45-degree orientation. Looking at just one macrostate, number 4, we can calculate the Euclidean distances between those matrices for each combination of the 8 conditions. So again, 2 expectation values, 2 stimulus types, and 2 orientations. You have an 8 by 8 matrix. Again, we can spend time scrutinizing this, but I want to save time on that and just move forward maybe to this plot, which is kind of the bottom line for now for this experiment. So what you see here is macrostate time sequences for the 2 conditions, expectation and no expectation. Now the 4 time sequences corresponding to the expectation condition are these ones here, and they are clearly separated in this reduced dimensionality space from the 4 time sequences for the no expectation condition. The very small type labels on the points are the timeline, and the 4 points are the 4 macrostates in each case. So remember what I claimed to be the case, the sequence of macrostates is the experience. So what you see here, just like in that olfactory perception diagram from the locust, where there was a divergence between the state space trajectories corresponding to the 2 odorants. Here we have, for one thing, the most visible characteristic of this data set is the separation between the expectation, no expectation conditions. It's kind of promising. The data analysis is very much in progress, and I'll leave it at that. And if you have questions later, if we have time for questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. But we are kind of on track to do, or to try to do, for our human subjects in visual perception, visual consciousness, what has been done in that study which I outlined in locust olfaction. Okay, so we are almost done here. I covered all this ground, and now up to next to some objections. And this one having to do with causation, I promised to return to the question of causation. Where is the real causation? Is it at the micro level or the macro level? There's a great paper by Hoel, and I think Larissa Albantakis is one of the co-authors, and Giulio Tononi, on how in the integrated information theory, macro can beat micro. So if you're in favor, or if you would rather see the, say, the brain as some kind of symbolic computer, this should be good news, because this means that things are happening at the macro level where symbolic computation happens, which need not be described exclusively in terms of the low level, the implementation level. So the answer to, I'm not pretending that I'll settle this question of can you ignore micro in favor of the macro level, the macro states. I will just offer you a quote from Carlo Rovelli, a physicist, not just a physicist, kind of a very famous physicist, who also writes popular books. By the way, I enjoyed some of his books recently. And this is from one of his very recent technical reports. You can download it from arXiv, on the concept of agency in physics. The concept of agency seems not to belong in physics, but Rovelli thinks otherwise. And I mean, I can say for whatever it's worth, I agree with him. I should say probably it resonates with me a lot. So let me just read this quote from that very short paper by him. So he writes, if high-level concepts are sufficient to account for behavior, this is a normal case of causal closure of a coarse-grained account of events. So coarse-graining, a concept which I used, turns out it's very popular. In fact, it is indispensable in physics, and it goes under a different name, the renormalization process or renormalization group. But it's kind of nice to know that it's actually pretty striking to find out that such key idea from, I think it's a key idea in the theory of consciousness that is taking shape, is also a common concept in physics. Okay, so continuing the quote, high-level concepts from this perspective are normal macroscopic variables. A computer playing chess, for instance, chooses a move on the basis of rules. This is an unproblematic case of causal closure of a macroscopic description. If, on the contrary, high-level concepts are not sufficient to account for behavior, then we are back to the micro-macro context. Something else is doing the choice. If it's not the macrophysics, it must be the microphysics. And then he goes on to point out that there are always very many microhistories compatible with any given high-level account, leaving space for branching. Neither case conflicts with the causal closure of the microscopic physics. Ultimately, agency is always nothing else than ignoring some physical links. You know, think of a system playing chess, could be a computer, could be a human being. A gamma ray, cosmic ray comes from outer space, passes through the brain, and maybe it causes you to make a different move from what you'd intended before, which would be describable in terms of a violation, or maybe you try to do a move that's illegal in chess. Okay, that would be the consequence, one possible consequence. Or it might not percolate all the way to that level of actual chess moves. Something changed. Instead of moving your bishop to that square, you still moved it to that square, but maybe 1 millimeter short of the center of the square. That's a microscopic difference which does not make a difference on the macro level. So that's as much as I wanted to say on the question of causality and is it micro or macro. The next, I think this is the last question or the last objection. Well, one but last. Quoting from the poem, where is fancy bread, in the heart or in the head? Where is phenomenal experience to be found? In birds, I would say yes. In bees, probably yes. So we have this paper with Roy and Tomer, a commentary on Klein and Barron, which is titled in a punny way, "To Be or Not to Be." What about the bacteria? Yes, I think so. That useless box, yes, kind of stretching it, but still yes, very tiny bit of experience. A bimetallic strip, the bugbear of the philosophers of consciousness. Is the thermostat on my wall over there, is it conscious? Well, not on its own, but when you connect it to the furnace and it does its job of heating or cooling the room depending on the setting, how can you say with a straight face that it is not aware of the temperature of the room? I couldn't be. So a plain bimetallic strip on its own, no. But one that is put together with other components forming a system, even as simple as the useless box, yes. And then the final objection, and it's a big one. So the DET story is all about the doings of systems, but out of mere doings, you can never get feelings. So that's an objection that's very, very hard to deal with. Of course, this goes straight to the heart of the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And my take on it is you just have to bite the bullet. So any explanation that's not mystification, anything that's not panpsychism, or just mysteriousness being kept alive, will have to do the reduction, and will have to say something along the lines of feelings just are a certain class of doings. And so that's the best counter argument that I can offer to this argument, such as it is, against the possibility of a mechanistic account of phenomenal awareness of the type that I've outlined. So just to drive this point home, let me share this little experience with you. This is from the great film by Pedro Almodovar, choreography by the late Pina Bausch, Hable con ella. Some people say this is not dance, this is just some movement, people going through movements. But of course, people going through movements sometimes is dance. Okay, I promised a happy ending, and here we are. I'll leave you with this picture of a moonset in that place in Death Valley, which I mentioned a bit earlier.